Hello, I am Winter in Baseball. I'm continuing, I guess, what you call my baseball biography. I'm going to start to call it baseball memories because I think that's probably resonates a little bit more than biography for some guy that nobody knows who he is. So baseball memories, that's what we're calling this now. I don't have my lighting, so this is going to look even more 2007 than it already did, and this cat still is determined to be in all of my videos. Um, Also, there's an S tier thing that has absolutely nothing to do with this video. It's a completely separate project that we're working on, so you get to look at that in the background. It's a little weird, but whatever. We're gonna go with it. So where we left off, like I said, the 1998 video was kind of covered in my Sammy Sosa video, which is actually my first video, but I go through 1996 and beyond when I was born, and we're up to, since I'm skipping 1998 because I've already talked about it, in the 1999 and 2000 seasons. The 99 and 2000 seasons are mostly not memorable for me Cubs wise because they were pretty bad. They're the first bad Cubs teams I experienced as a fan of the team, not just as somebody who knew the Cubs were bad. And also, just real quick, this is kind of a fun little shirt. The Salem Witches actually were a minor league baseball team that existed, however, in 1888, so I guess I won't be talking about them because I don't really know much about them anyways. And then the California Angels hat, I'm pretty sure they're the Anaheim Angels at this point, so this hat is not even relevant to what time period I'm talking about. So good job for me, but we're just gonna move on and keep talking about baseball in 1999 and 2000. But the 1999 season, the Cubs were pretty bad. I thought they're going to build upon the 1998 season, but the reality was they were probably a pretty lucky team who had one guy who was absolutely dominant. And the next season they were not as lucky and they were pretty bad. Although to start the season, the first couple of months of the season, I do remember them winning a lot of close ball games, and it kind of felt like they were on another run, just like in 1998, and that they're going to go to the playoffs for a second consecutive year. And maybe this team was actually like destined to win, but that did not turn out to be the case. And in the year 2000 Cubs, they were also a bad team, but I do remember a very distinct season, or is it very distinct part of the season where they cut the lead to like 6 games or something, and for like a minute, I thought, hey, the Cubs are going to come back. It's going to be a great comeback in the season. They're going to make the playoffs and they're going to win the World Series. They did none of that. They ended up also being pretty bad in the year 2000. So the 1999 and 2000 Cubs teams were pretty just not very good at baseball. The actual seasons of baseball, I do remember. So I kind of would continue my, I'm not going to say Yankee fandom at this point because I definitely was not following them that closely, but I would kind of pick them for the playoffs. So kind of my playoff fandom of the Yankees continued in 1999 and 2000. So once the Cubs were completely done and the playoffs started, I completely jumped on that Yankee bandwagon and I did root for the 99 Yankees and they ended up beating the Braves in the World Series. And that was tabbed as like the team of the 90s, like who's going to be the team of the 90s. I remember that was kind of the storyline of the whole thing. And it should have been an epic showdown, kind of a rematch in the 1996 World Series. It was the end of the decade, so you had the Yankees who were not good in the early half, but went on to win the World Series in '96, and then they ended up winning in '98. Had the best record in American League history at the time, and then 1999, they go to the World Series trying to get their third. Meanwhile, the Braves were kind of well known for winning multiple pennants, but then not be able to break through. Although they did finally break through in 1996. So the Yankees won at that point. They were going for their third championship. The Braves were going for their second. So if the Braves had won, they would have had two world championships in the 90s, and the Yankees would have also had two. But the Braves had won a bunch of pennants, and ultimately, you could argue they were the best team of the decade. Because there was a point in the mid 90s where the Braves were the team of the decade. Bob Costas made the claim in 96 when they won the World Series. The team of the 90s has their world championship, but ultimately the Yankees kind of took over the decade in the second half of the 90s when they won three straight championships. If you count 2000 as part of the 90s, which I think mathematically you should, the Yankees ended up winning three straight because they won 98. They ended up winning in 1999 and they won in 2000. thing about the 1999 World Series is, again, it was supposed to be this amazing showdown, a rematch of the 96 series. The Braves, who were in the World Series quite often, they made the World Series, I want to say 1990, 91. Then they made it again in 96. They won it in 90. I'm sorry, 95 is when Bob Costas did that call, by the way. So 95, they won the World Series. They made it in 96, and I believe 99 was their fifth pennant of the decade, which in and of itself is really, really impressive, especially in an era where you still have to get through a round of playoffs. Because there was a time in baseball, of course, where if you won the league, you ended up going to the World Series directly. But with the playoffs, there's an extra round. There's an extra round of baseball shenanigans that can happen, and ultimately, you can get left out. I mean, that's kind of what happened to the Braves in 1993 when they were probably the best team in the National League, and they kind of wore themselves out to beat the Giants, who didn't even make the playoffs because of the whole playoff format, and they lost to the Phillies. But the Braves, very impressive feat that they were able to get to five pennants in the 90s, and unfortunately for them, they only won one World Series. But that's the way it kind of works in that sport. Where any random thing can happen. Like who knows who's going to win it? But it seemed like we were primed for just a great showdown between the two franchises. Very hyped World Series. Kind of reminded me of this year a little bit, where the Yankees were the best team in the AL. The NL had the best team was the Dodgers, and seemed like we're gonna have a hype series, and the series itself was kind of a letdown. Um, this year, the Yankees ended up losing in five after going down 3-0. So after Game Four, which is a pretty good game, kind of famous because of the whole fans taking the ball out of the glove of Mookie Betts and all that stuff. Ultimately, it wasn't really a series that lived up to the hype. It ended up being a short series. This series was even worse in the sense that the Braves absolutely just got whitewashed. The Yankees just absolutely dominated in that series, and they swept them. And it was kind of a letdown of a series that seemed like it could have been an epic classic. It's kind of forgettable, like now when I look back on it, it's like, oh yeah, the 1995 World Series was the Yankees and the Braves, whereas the 1996 Yankees and the Braves series was much better, but also was more of an underdog versus up and comer story, which is kind of funny because the underdog ended up being the dominant team of the decade and having the last three-peat that we've ever had because they ended up going to the year 2000, and I was still rooting for the Yankees in the year 2000, and or at least in the playoffs, not as much in the regular season. I would follow them loosely, but you kind of knew the Yankees were gonna run through the division and get there, so it was not really like something I was super excited about. Plus, I was still a Cubs fan at this point, so I wanted the Cubs to win, and it was still very, very much if the Cubs play the Yankees in the World Series, I know who I'm going to pick. I'm still going to pick the Cubs, and that's all there is to it. But there was no Cubs playing the Yankees in the World Series in the year 2000. The Cubs were once again bad, and I do remember. I think it was the 2000 season. It might have been the 99 season, but I'm pretty sure it was the year 2000 season because we had just moved to my our new house at the time when that happened in the year 2000. And I remember reading newspaper articles in that house talking about Sammy Sosa potentially getting traded to the Yankees. Um, I, at the time, like I said, was kind of a Yankees fan, like a bandwagon when they were good, sort of thing. Still wasn't too excited about that prospect because I really like Sammy Sosa on the Cubs, and it just wouldn't have seemed right to me that he played for another team. Although obviously he played for another team before the Cubs, he played for another team after the Cubs. He played for two teams after the Cubs. But that was a whole different thing. This was the Cubs trying to get rid of a high contract because I do believe they paid him a lot of money after the 98 season, which is at the time justifiably so. Like you would have set the all-time home run record in a single season if another guy didn't hit 70 home runs. And basically, Sammy Sosa carried the Cubs to the playoffs. He carried the Cubs' popularity in a lot of ways. He carried the city of Chicago's popularity in a lot of ways. Um, in some ways, I know like he was not beloved by half the fans of the city. Like I know Chicago White Sox fans definitely did not like Sammy Sosa for numerous reasons. And then obviously once the cheating stuff happened later on, then things got even worse. But that stuff wasn't completely there. I do feel like there was rumblings. Like I feel like Skip Bayless was a Chicago sports writer before he became the ESPN annoying guy and Fox and whatever it is he's doing now. I know he's dealing with some issues, but But I do remember Skip Bayless at the time was very vocal about Sammy Sosa not being a good person ultimately. I think his reasoning was mostly because Sammy's flair came off as like arrogant and he came across as me first to him, while at the same time like the public persona was like, "Oh, look how fun I am," and that sort of thing. It was basically just Skip Bayless being Skip Bayless. Although, sure, I'm sure Sosa had some selfish qualities. That's, I mean, ultimately a lot of multi-million dollar athletes do, or people do. I don't know. I never like saw Sosa as selfish as a player. I can kind of see where some of that stuff would come from, but I just personally never saw that. Um, and it was really frustrating because ultimately the cheating stuff happened, like between the PEDs and the corked bat, where you're like, oh, now the public sentiment towards Sosa's seem to be turning, and maybe these people who aren't so positive about him uh, are correct. But all that, a lot of that's like Skip Bayless is one of the first people who I really remember having a negative approach about Sammy Sosa, and that was also the first time I'd heard of Skip Bayless. And this was before he was on ESPN. I think he was a writer for the Tribune or Subtimes or one of the Chicago newspapers, so that's kind of where he was going. And I think he covered for Jim Rome a little bit back in the day. And I just remember every time this Skip Bayless guy talking about Sosa just really infuriated me because that's just what he does. I mean, he just says stuff that like is designed to like agitate and cause that sort of controversy and basically watch him. He's a troll. I mean, that's what Skip Bayless is. Whatever, it's ended up working for him successfully, I guess. But that's when I had heard of him. I heard him way before all this stuff, and I remember just hating that guy. I could not stand listening to his opinions. I thought he was a complete blowhard and very anti. It was more because of his anti-Sammy opinions, and that's just ultimately really ticked me off. And I remember a lot of that stuff coming from them. So I do remember there's some negative Sammy Sosa opinions going into like that into that 2000 season. I can't remember if people were making the claims of steroids yet. I know at some point during that time, and maybe it was a year or two later, I can't remember the exact time frame when people started looking at Sosa, who was skinnier earlier in his career, or Barry Bonds. The head size thing, I remember with Barry Bonds, like it was like, oh, look how big his head is. His head's grown so much, and there's people just taking these side by side old pictures versus new pictures, and they're like, something's not right. But there's nothing really official. But it was also like it was always like message board banter online, and I kind of do remember being like, well, that is a little weird, but what is it proof of? I mean, ultimately, Sammy Sosa did come from a poorer upbringing. It's possible he just more like got more nutrition and got bigger, and it's also possible that like, hey, Barry Bonds now he's not focused on being the five-tool player he used to be. He's more getting into the gym, getting bigger. Strength has become a bigger thing in baseball, you know, because of the home runs, and now these players are going to be focusing more on that as opposed to other aspects of the game. There was probably a little not even naivety. I knew that it's possible that some negative things could be happening. Like I knew of the cocaine scandal in the 80s. Like before, I knew like athletes are fallible human beings, and I wasn't necessarily expecting all of them to be saints. But I didn't want to completely believe, hey, they're outright cheating, um, without more tangible proof, which was never going to come because of the way baseball treated this stuff. There was never like concrete testing until a few years later. But I don't remember necessarily when all that stuff really started. So I do remember. I think mostly. I think mostly what happened back then. I think a lot of the negative sentiments against guys who hit a lot of home runs, who also struck out a lot, is that they're basically trying to hit home runs when it doesn't matter. One of the biggest critiques I've always seen in baseball is like, oh, he hit a home run when his team was down 8-1. He does that all the time. Like, when does he? Why doesn't he do that with guys on base? I don't know if it's a valid critique. It's just one of those things that you see happen a lot. I think ultimately, if your team's down 8-1, what are you gonna do? Not have a good at bat? Like, you're still gonna try the best you can to hit the ball, and if it goes out of the ballpark, like I don't think that's a reason to indict a person. And I guarantee when Sammy, because Sammy hit 60 home runs three different times, and I believe it would have been no 2001 he did for sure. I don't remember if it was 90. I think 99 or 2000 he also did it, but it could have been 02. Without looking it up offhand, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but Sammy was hitting a bunch of home runs regardless. Even if it wasn't 60, I'm sure it was 50 or 40 at the very least. And at some point you're going to hit meaningful home runs. Although this team was bad, like that's also part of it too. The team was losing games. Like they're going to be down 8-1 a lot. So unfortunately, your only good player might hit a lot more home runs when your team's down 8-1. And because you're seeing like people watching the games, they're going to see their team is bad. They're going to automatically assume, hey, this guy only hits home runs when they don't matter. I'm like, well, most of the games don't matter. They suck. But I always thought that critique was just weird. Like I think most for the most part, you only get 3 or 4 at bats in a game. Like the guy's gonna most of the time try as hard as they can to hit, and I just thought that critique made no sense. But I think that's ultimately like what the major critique was of players like Sosa, especially like the more flair oriented, like players with a lot of flair, players with a lot of I don't know that style to their game, especially back then. I think you still see it now a little bit, but back then players weren't showing as much flair. I know there was definitely times they would do it. Like you would still see guys like pose. I remember David Ortiz would pose after hitting a home run. Sammy Sosa did his hop. Guys were starting to you don't not like today where there's like these massive bat flips and things like that. But players back then still would hit a home if they hit a deep home run, they would definitely admire it a little bit. There's definitely players who would take their time running the bases. Like that stuff did happen a little bit back then. But I do think it would come with the caveat of, oh, this player's selfish or me first or that kind of thing. And so I think ultimately when your team's losing a lot, like Sammy Sosa's were, and we didn't seem to have as big of a deep of an understanding that like this is especially like an ultimate team sport. It's not like basketball. A guy can score 40 points, get 10 rebounds and all that stuff, and he has a lot more impact on the game because he's one of 5 players who plays both ends of the court. In baseball, you have your 3 at bats a game, and if nobody else is getting on base, you hit 3 home runs. Yeah, it's a really good individual game, but you only score 3 runs, which doesn't win games all the time. Like you can lose a lot of games scoring only 3 runs. So one individual player can't really change the outcome, especially on offense. Pitching, you can argue, controls a little bit more, but then they don't pitch every day either. So one individual player in baseball does not control the sport like it does in other sports, like it does in basketball or even football a little bit, even hockey. Like even though like the shifts they have in hockey are very very short, if a guy scores 3 goals, 3 goals in hockey goes a lot further than it does in baseball. So I think there's the lens of like people want to call a guy a winner and use championships to grade individual players, and that can work a little bit more in other sports, but in baseball it doesn't really work. Otherwise, and granted, like Yogi Berra is one of the best catchers ever, regardless because of his talent. But if you just went solely on rings, Yogi Berra is the best catcher of all, like best baseball player of all time, which I don't see how that's true. Not granted, he's a Hall of Famer and he was really, really good, but to say that he's the best ever would be a bit of a stretch. And so, like using rings in sports, and using wins in sports, and that sort of a team sport, I don't think really works. But I think that's a principle that people still try to apply to individual players in baseball. And I think with somebody like Sosa, who had that flair, who played with that sort of something that could be viewed as me first, the way he like blew kisses, the way he ran out to right field, the way he did all that stuff. I think with that, if the team's losing and you're doing that to certain people, it does, and you're getting a very very high salary because Sosa was getting paid a lot at this point. That does rub the certain fans the wrong way, I think. And I think what happened with that is the team was losing and he's getting high paid, and maybe it was time in some people's minds to move him along. And the New York Yankees at the time were the team that spent the most money. Like they were the evil empire, is what they were called. And the biggest reason for that was because they would just spend money constantly. I mean, they ended up getting how many high-end contracts in that time period? Just offhand, I can think of A-Rod, who they ended up getting. They didn't sign him, but they traded for him, and he had a massive contract. And then Jason Giambi, I remember they're kind of doing some September deals just to kind of steal players from other teams. This is probably earlier, like 1998. I remember Jose Canseco was one of those players. I think Cecil Fielder was another player like that. So the Yankees had no problems throwing money around. They're the richest team in baseball, and they were the perfect team to take this like superstar Chicago Cubs player who just hit 60 home runs, who's getting spends a lot of money, which on a team that just isn't winning. So it was a lot of payroll going towards one person when it could be going towards a lot of people. So I think that the trade seemed to make a lot of sense to people. I don't know how close it ever got to being made. I just remember the trade rumors being pretty big. And I do kind of remember me like, I want him to stay on the Cubs, but I also understand he's aging. He's, makes a lot of money. And if he goes to the Yankees, now this is a team that was already winning. I mean, 1999, they're going for their second World Series. They're going for the third World Series in 4 years. And actually no, because they had already won. They won in 1999, so they had won three World Series in 4 years. They won two in a row. In the year 2000, they're going for their third. And if they add Sammy Sosa to the mix, who knows what happens further? Because in the year 2000, they beat the Mets, which I was rooting for. I was rooting for the Subway Series in the year 2000 because I thought it would be really, really cool if two teams from the same city played. And the series itself wasn't great. I think the Mets won one game. The Yankees ended up winning in five. Everybody kind of thought the Yankees would win. And the reality is, I think people outside of the city of New York probably weren't too thrilled to see two teams from New York played. I personally thought it was cool. It was definitely something I was rooting for at the time, just because I thought it would be, I don't know, a little niche thing, I suppose. Because baseball, I feel like needs a little bit of novelty sometimes. I think that's why originally when the World Series before interleague play, I think originally that's why the World Series was so fascinating, is because you had this novelty of two leagues that never play each other. But now we're at a point where interleague play happens. And in the year 2000, like those two teams had already played before. Like the intercity matchups happened every single season. So Yankees and Mets wasn't necessarily a rare matchup. It was definitely like a matchup that had happened before. But in the World Series, that was a new thing to have two cities in the same two teams from the same city play each other for the first time since maybe the early six. No, because the Mets, the Giants had moved by the time the '60s started when the Yankees played the Giants. So I think the Yankees and Giants played in '61, but that was the San Francisco Giants. So we hadn't had that since the '50s. So I mean, at that point, you're looking at 45 years until something like that happened. So that was something that I found very, very. I don't know. It was something I definitely rooted for. I like the novelty of it. I thought it gave the World Series a little bit of a different feel, especially because my team wasn't going to be involved. So I just wanted to see something new and different that hadn't happened before, and it did happen. It wasn't a very exciting World Series, like I said, but that's remember with that. And now I'm thinking of like if that Sammy Sosa trade had happened, the next year Sammy Sosa puts up his, and I'm going to talk about more about the 2001 team in a different video because I kind of want to do 2001 through 2004 in its own separate thing because hey, that's when I was in high school, and probably the most impactful baseball seasons of my life occurred then. Now, granted, the year 2000, I was also in high school, but that's when I started high school, and that Cubs team is like so forgettable that I don't even want to include this. But like the 2001 team, very impactful, meaningful to me. The '03 team, very meaningful for different reasons. And then the 2004 team was also very, very memorable, and they kind of ended on such a sour note that I think it kind of just encapsulates a perfect time period. So the '01 through '04 teams I want to talk about on their own because that's probably my most memorable era of baseball period as a fan, as a Cubs fan especially. But that era of baseball is when I would come home after my own baseball games or come home from doing whatever once I wasn't playing baseball anymore to watching those games, like watching highlights on Baseball Tonight, like watching games with my dad, like almost every single night. Just so many memorable things from that time period that stuck with me for a long time. And not to mention, the heartbreaking way the Cubs lost in '03 and the '04 season, which they kind of choked. Um, and that's also the season really where I started to really, really hate the St. Louis Cardinals and get into that rivalry a lot more. But that's something I'll talk about in the next video. So going back to what I was talking about here, Sammy Sosa, like I said, year 2000, never really knew how close it was to happening, to getting traded to the Yankees. I honestly don't know. I just remember the rumors were definitely there, but it could have just been I lived in the Quad Cities, and locally we got the paper from the Illinois side, and I'm sure like a lot of the news stories were being funneled from Chicago news. So it could have just been easily Chicago newspapers putting that stuff out to kind of fuel readers up a little bit. So I don't know how close that trade ever was to happening. But if you think of what happens if the Cubs do trade for, or if the Sammy Sosa does go to the New York Yankees, The 2001 team lost the World Series in Game 7 of they lost in Game 7 to the Diamondbacks. Obviously, Mario Runner blew a save, which was rare, and who knows? Sammy Sosa, a guy who had his best season ever. He had a better season in 2001 than he did in 1998. Hit more home runs in 1988, but he still hit 60 plus home runs. And the year 2000 was definitely Sosa's best year. If you inject that into that Yankees lineup, who knows what happens? Now, granted, World Series, very, very small sample size. He could have easily gone ice cold, wouldn't have made a difference. But one or two different at bats from Sosa, having one of the best seasons, honestly, in baseball history, offensively. At least you have to think. I'm just kind of throwing that out there, but I mean, you're hitting 60 plus home runs, and you're having a 200 plus OPS plus, and things like that that season. I mean, it has to be one of the better seasons that's ever happened. And he almost carried the Cubs to the playoffs single-handedly. Again, I'll talk about this in the next video. I don't want to get too far into it because it's such a meaningful time for me myself as a fan. But if you inject him onto that Yankees team in 2001, who knows what happens? I mean, if the Yankees win that World Series, they win four straight, and then in 2002 they lose in the playoffs. Who knows what happens that year? And then 03 they actually lose in the World Series. So you're looking at a Yankees team who would have had four straight, could have won five of six. Sosa wasn't as great in 03. Don't know what ultimately would have happened if they could have gotten over the hump against the Marlins. The Marlins was a red hot team. They were really, really good that year. But four straight, possibly 5 and 6 years, and then 2002, the Yankees are still a playoff team. Who knows what happens if you add that quality of player to that season? Maybe six in a row for the Yankees, which would be absolutely absurd. The fact that they won three in the wild card era of the playoffs, like you have to think about this. Like the Yankees, they won five in a row in the early 50s, but the thing with that was if you won your league, you went to the World Series. You only have to win one series of baseball. And the playoffs are kind of a crapshoot in the sense that like anything can happen in a I mean the longest a baseball series can go is 7 games. Real play like real teams. I'm sure if you looked at excuse me, the 116 Seattle Mariners of 2001, and that's another thing I want to talk about. The whole 2001 season was incredible, but the 2001 Mariners who won 116 games, I'm sure there was a stretch where they went 3-4 in 7 games. I could be wrong, but even if they didn't, most teams in baseball have a stretch where they go 3-4. Countless teams who win 100 games go 3-4 in a stretch, and that's not even like considering the fact that they're playing another really really good team in those 7 games. So anything can happen, and to me, it doesn't mean like a team's a choking team. It doesn't mean that they're just can't get the job done. They're not winners. It doesn't mean any of that stuff. It just means baseball happened. For 7 games, you weren't good enough to be another really, really good team. But you're still a really, really good team. You just had one of those stretches that teams have all the time. And the Yankees in the early 50s avoided that. Like they never had that issue. The other aspect of that too is I do think teams were kind of not as evenly matched at that time period as they are now. I think you have teams are a lot closer in terms of talent. Although maybe that's changing too because with all these rounds of playoffs, the two best teams in each league ended up playing in the World Series last year. We'll see if that's a trend that continues. I'm not really sure, but I still think like the fact that the Yankees were able to win 3 straight World Championships, where they had to play 3 rounds to win the championship, 3 rounds of baseball. First round's only a best of 5, even smaller stretch where you can have 5 bad games or 3 bad games in 5 games, and then you're done. That's it. And we've seen it happen all the time with great teams. There's so many great teams who lose in that round. The 116 win Mariners team, they lose in the second round. Record wise, they're better than the 2001 Yankees, although the 2001 Yankees were really, really good. But you have you have these things happen constantly, and the Yankees were able to avoid it. Never happened to them until 2001, where they lose Game 7 because the greatest closer in baseball history blows a game, which rarely ever happened, obviously. Could have won 4 in a row. 4 in a row would have been even more absurd. And I think like who knows what happens? I mean, you throw Sammy Sosa into that mix, and all of a sudden, maybe they don't do that. And that to me, I mean, but that to me, like when I think of the late '90s, and I know I'm just kind of going all over the place, but I don't have much to talk about with the Cubs and myself in these 2 years. When you look at the 98 through 2000 Yankees teams, that to me might even be the greatest dynasty in baseball history because of the challenge of going through all those rounds to win a championship. Like that, I don't know if it was luck. I don't know if a lot of luck was involved. I don't know if there really is more to it than that, where this team knew how to hit timely. They knew how to win. Maybe that exists more than we give credit for in baseball. But whatever ultimately happened, like that team was able to do it, and that was ridiculously impressive. Um, I guess going back to myself a little bit more personally in that time period, I do remember back to Mario Rivera. I went to I want to say this is in 2000, could have been 1999, but I'm pretty sure it was the year 2000 because if I remember correctly, the Chicago White Sox made the playoffs in this year, and we went to see the Yankees and White Sox play at in Chicago, and it would have been one of the years. I'm pretty sure it was a year where the White Sox were a playoff contender, and the Yankees, of course, were the Yankees, and they played. I don't even remember. It was like a night game. There was like two rain delays. The game went forever, and I think it might have went extra innings. But if it didn't go extra innings, it definitely ended in the bottom of the ninth. And what was most memorable about this game to me was the fact that it was a completely packed, sold out park, very raucous atmosphere. It kind of felt like going to a playoff game, which I had not been to a playoff game before at that point. I've been to two since, so not like I've had a whole extensive experience with that, but I have been to multiple playoff baseball games since. But it was just a great crowd, and the White Sox were losing to the Yankees, and Mariano Rivera actually pitched for the Yankees and blew a save. And the White Sox ended up walking off the game. I don't remember the exact details on how or anything like that. I just remember seeing that. I was rooting for the Yankees, not necessarily out of dislike of the White Sox, which I hadn't really acquired that till later on as a Cubs fan. And I've kind of dropped it now too. I think mostly because I feel bad for that franchise. Um, because the last season they went, the last couple of seasons has just been honestly disgraceful. But at the time, I was rooting for the Yankees to win just because I like the Yankees. They were still my second favorite team, and they come back and they won the game. They came back and the White Sox came back and won the game. And I guess looking back, that's probably one of the more memorable things I've seen as a fan is Mariano Rivera blowing a save. Just because, and I'm sure it happened frequently enough where it's not like, oh, I saw that happen. That's so crazy. But it was enough of a rare thing. I mean, the guy got to the Hall of Fame. He's the only unanimously voted in Hall of Famer, and it was solely because of his ability to close out games and to get saves, and to be such a big part of multiple championship winning Yankee teams. So in a way, it was a rare thing. It's kind of like saying like went to and granted, it probably didn't happen as much as like a 500 home run hitter hitting 500 home runs, but there is still an element of like, hey, I saw whoever King Griffey Jr. I saw King Griffey Jr. hit a home run. That's still cool to say that you saw, even though it was a pretty common thing. And Mariano Rivera blowing that many saves was obviously not a common thing, but I'm sure it still happened because it's baseball and closing out games is still very hard, and so is pitching. It happened enough where it's not like bragging about seeing a no hitter or a perfect game or anything like that. But it's still one of the more cool things that I've seen as a baseball fan is Mariano Rivera blowing a save and losing a game. And then that year, both teams I actually saw play. This is probably one of the better MLB games I ever actually saw because of how it went so late. Went extra innings. Mariano Rivera blowing a save. It was a walk off. I haven't seen a lot of walk offs in my life at the major league level. I've seen a couple, but not too many. Um, but it was cool to just like I don't know see what was basically like just a really good baseball game with a good atmosphere. I think mostly I remember it for the multiple rain delays, and then there was actually a lot of traffic going to Chicago, and what should have been like a 2.5 3 hour drive, I remember it took like 6 7 hours, and it was insane. So that part kind of was not as enjoyable as I would have liked, and I think just ultimately I was tired, and it just wasn't like the most pleasant of experiences. But and also like I just don't like because I remember sitting one of the top rows at Comiskey Park again because that seems to be the only place I sit in that ballpark. and that place is so steep. And I've said this before in the previous video, like I hate sitting in that park. Like it's too tall. I'm scared of heights. Not like I used to be. Like I could handle it more now. But at that age, I was scared of heights. I don't like walking. In fact, I remember going down to get concessions, or maybe we moved down because multiple rain delays. Like I said, it was a packed park, but I think people took off a little early at some point. And I remember going down and getting some better seats, still in the upper deck, because I know the way Reinsdorf likes to run baseball teams or sporting teams. He doesn't like people in the cheap seats to be able to go to any other like level of the stadium. I know he doesn't do that in Chicago, and I'm pretty sure for the Bulls, and I'm pretty sure that's the same case for the White Sox. Although I haven't been to that park in like 20 years now. But at the time, we did move down and got better seats down below. But I think the reason that I enjoy doing that, not so much for the better view, but it was so I didn't have to walk all the way up to the top of that stadium again. Because I just, even behind home plate, it wasn't like the same seats that I had sitting in left field in the upper deck. This was behind home plate, but that stadium is so high when you're even when you're like behind home plate, it feels like you're on top of home plate. And that was just it just felt like when I was walking up the stairs, I was just going straight up, and it was just very disorienting, and I did not enjoy it. So I feel like the main reason that I wanted to do that, sorry, something in my arm. The main reason I wanted to do that was because I didn't want to walk up the stairs again. So I remember that those aspects of the game a lot more than the actual game itself. But it was a really good baseball game. So that's the other thing I remember about the year 2000, in terms of myself. Um, and then also this is definitely more me. I remember our my eighth grade year, my pony league baseball team went to our league championship. I was actually the closer on the team, and I discovered pitching a slider for the first time in my life, and it was kind of fun because I could actually like throw the ball right at people and have it break over the plate. Probably would have wrecked my arm if I kept doing it longer, but I was never gonna like go pro or even pitch beyond eighth grade. It was actually the only year I pitched. I never even pitched in high school, and I didn't really throw that hard. But I could make the ball spin, and that was only for 1 year. It was really annoying because I remember I was outside playing catch with a friend, and I just started screwing around throwing pitches, and I ended up discovering a slider, and I could make the ball spin really well. Like it literally would go right at people, go over the plate. People would dive out of the plate. It's kind of a fun feeling, not gonna lie. And then the next year, I completely lost touch of it. It was literally just that one little stretch where I could do it. But I was playing catch, and I didn't even pitch the whole season. I think we were just running out of people who could pitch because people's arms were getting sore, and we didn't really have a team with great pitchers. I think we ended up winning mostly because of the two good pitchers that we had, and I don't know. It was eighth grade baseball. Like I'm not gonna go too deep in it, but I do remember playing catch before a game, and I was throwing that pitch, and my coach saw me, and he's like, "I'm gonna have you pitch today," and or I might have you pitch today, or something like that. It was like I might have you pitch today, and we got to the end of a tough game. We were playing one of the other good teams in the league. I think it was like 1-0, and he had me go out there and pitch, and I got the save. I got a big save. We ended up winning a game against a really good team. And then I did it a couple other times. I ended up starting a game against one of the worst teams in the league, and I couldn't throw strikes. I have no idea what happened. I just remember not being able to throw the ball over the plate. Maybe I got the yips. I'm not really sure. It's probably why I'm not in the majors now. That's the only reason. But yeah. Other than that game, couldn't start the game. But when for whatever reason, like the late innings of those games, I was the team's closer. So it's kind of interesting because I guess I was Mariano Rivera, although I didn't blow a save that year. I had three. I didn't really pitch that many games, but three games in Pony League baseball was actually probably quite a bit. But what ended up happening is I ended up going to a church camp late in the season, so I didn't get to play. I think I played one of our tournament games, and I didn't even know what happened. I knew I got everything that happened secondhand when I returned from the church camp because another friend on the team told me. And he was like, "Yeah, we made it to the championship game. It was a double elimination tournament. We only had to win one game, and we would have won the championship. But we didn't. We lost both games." And so that was kind of depressing because I never won a championship. Again, not that I've competed at very many levels, but I still would have been cool to win a championship of some kind. But it was also depressing. So it was depressing to come back and hear that, but also like you don't know what was going on at the church camp. It was kind of like you just there's no texting back then. It was just a cell phone call if anything, and I'm not even sure I had uh, any sort of any sort of way to receive a phone call in the middle of the woods, anyways. And I'm pretty sure I heard about it on an answering machine. It wouldn't have been like a voicemail even. I'm not even sure I had a cell phone in the year 2000. I honestly don't remember, but I know I got the information secondhand. Ended up finding out we lost second round, or we got second place because we lost in the tournament in that heartbreaking way. But it was a weird feeling because I'm like, yeah, I wish my team had won the championship. That would have been nice if we came back and I got to be happy about that. But also, like, I didn't know any of it happened until later on. And then I could always kind of use the caveat of, like, well, I wasn't there. So if I had played, maybe we win that championship. So to this day, I'm still steadfastly holding on to this. I'm 38 years old now. That would have been 25 years ago. But I'm still convinced if I had played in those games, we would have won the championship that year. But unfortunately, the history books have written we came in second, and I'm just left to really imagine what if. Um, but honestly, that season was probably more memorable to me than any sort of Cubs game would have been that season. But so that's the 1999 through 2000, and now you've actually gotten from the story of my baseball memories from 1986 to the year 2000. So what I'm gonna do going forward, I might try to cover longer stretches of this, mostly because some of it's going to be more recent. Like once we get up to the next, like the last decade or so, like a lot of people have experienced it more fresher in the memory. But also because I think it's easier for me to separate these into bigger segments that correspond with bigger moments in my life. I guess I'm not sure, but like I said, I'm going to do 2001 through 2004 because those Cubs teams are probably the most memorable to me, aside from maybe the 15 and 16 teams. But I might even say that the 01 and 04 teams are more they're definitely more impactful because of my age at the time compared to my age with the team that won the World Series and that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about those teams a little bit more in depth. It's also like me being in high school. It's also the last time I ever played baseball myself, which did impact me emotionally quite a bit, even though I wasn't very good and I certainly came to terms with that, but it's still sad to like give up the game that you love playing. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I really want to dive into the 2001 team, like how meaningful that team was to me, and I think they're kind of an underrated Cubs team in terms of like Cubs lore because that summer was just ridiculously exciting to follow that team. And then obviously the 2003 team, everybody knows how that season ended with the Steve Bartman play. I'll kind of give my thoughts on that a little bit. I've written about it too. And then I also want to get my thoughts on that Marlins team because, like I've said before in the past, I used to be a Marlins fan. So it's kind of interesting that they're the team that probably ripped my heart out the most as a baseball team or as a baseball fan. And then I'll talk about the '04 team too, and just kind of that whole period. And then that'll basically take me to adulthood and to a time period where I probably shouldn't take this stuff as seriously as I do now. Although it's not what it used to be in high school. But I think most of that's because the Cubs won the World Series. I don't even know how much of that's me maturing. I think it's just because the Cubs won. I don't have to like pin all my hopes on this stuff. But we'll see how it goes. But like I said, the next segment, 2001 through 2004, one of my favorite times as a fan. We'll go through that, and if you enjoyed this, I definitely would appreciate liking, commenting, sharing, whatever you do on YouTube. Any of that stuff would be appreciated because I don't know, it'd be cool. But if not, I appreciate you for even watching this far in the video or even clicking on the video and looking at my face for 2 seconds and going, why is this guy wearing an Angels hat and talking about the Cubs and the Yankees for so much? And I haven't really even talked about the Angels at all. And is that woman swinging a baseball bat or riding a broom? What is happening? I don't know. But I appreciate anybody who looks at this. And then if you dive into this closely, you see ranking board with Disney movies on it. So that probably is even more confusing. But definitely appreciate if you watch this far into the video. Like I said, appreciate it. Have a good night.